In today's video, we dive into the chilling case of a ruthless gang who kidnapped a cryptocurrency investor and subjected him to months of violent extortion. Their first attack saw them take £100,000 in crypto, but after blowing through the money, they returned again and again, demanding more. Their final hit would be the most brutal, holding the victim hostage, torturing him, and forcing him to empty his entire digital fortune. But he refused, and events escalated beyond control. This is the story of a gang that thought they could outsmart the system, a victim trapped in a never-ending nightmare, and the police investigation that brought it all crashing down. In January 2023, the gang made their move. Scott Armstrong arrived at Mr. Smith's home, armed and threatening. His demand was simple: transfer a large sum of cryptocurrency or face the consequences. Fearing for his life, Mr. Smith complied, sending over £100,000 in digital assets. The gang had meticulously planned this attack, tracking Mr. Smith's online activity and financial movements. They knew exactly what they were looking for, and when they walked away with a fortune, they believed they had executed the perfect crime. There were no police reports, no headlines, just silence. To them, this was the ultimate sign of vulnerability. Mr. Smith had been too terrified to report what had happened, making him an easy target for future attacks. In the weeks following the robbery, the gang quickly burned through their stolen crypto wealth, spending recklessly on luxury items, drugs, and illicit dealings. But greed took hold, and soon they found themselves back where they started, desperate for more money. That's when they realized they could go back to the same victim. Mr. Smith had already paid once. He had stayed silent. What would stop them from taking even more? This was not just a one-time robbery. It was the beginning of a prolonged campaign of terror that would escalate to brutal levels. Later that same month, David Povey and another gang member visited Mr. Smith again. This time, they arrived armed with a knife, determined to extract even more cryptocurrency. Mr. Smith was physically assaulted, restrained, and subjected to a new wave of threats. The gang made it clear that if he refused, his family would suffer the consequences. Terrified and isolated, Mr. Smith had no choice but to comply once again, transferring another large sum of cryptocurrency into their accounts. He was left with bruises, cuts, and an overwhelming sense of fear. As the months passed, the attacks became more violent and calculated. In October 2023, Gary Edwards contacted Mr. Smith under false pretenses, pretending to be an investor interested in inheritance money. When Mr. Smith arrived at the arranged location in Cadishead, he was ambushed, dragged inside a flat, and immediately restrained. The gang tied him up, beat him, and locked him in a cupboard overnight. They demanded more money, warning him that if he failed to comply, he would be killed. Kane Goddiff, one of the more aggressive members, repeatedly reinforced the threat of execution. Trapped, terrified, and exhausted, Mr. Smith had no option but to transfer more funds to secure his release. But the gang was not finished. Just days later, they descended upon his home once more. This time, they forcibly took him to Egret Drive in Earlam, covering his head with a bag and restraining him. Again, the demands came. Another transfer, more money, more fear. However, something had changed. Mr. Smith had reached his breaking point. No longer willing to endure the torture, he finally contacted the police, setting in motion the chain of events that would lead to the gang's eventual downfall. While detectives quietly began investigating, the gang planned their biggest and final attack. On November 30th, 2023, they made their move. Gary Edwards approached Mr. Smith outside a friend's house, violently grabbed him, and forced him into a van. His head was covered, rendering him blind to his surroundings as he was driven to Egret Drive, where Jonathan Nunes, David Povey, and Carl Johnson were waiting. The gang had no intention of letting him go without draining every last bit of his cryptocurrency fortune. For 2 days, Mr. Smith endured unimaginable torture. He was bound, starved, and subjected to relentless beatings. The gang burned his skin, struck him with weapons, and psychologically tormented him, demanding access to his remaining crypto holdings. They threatened his life repeatedly, making it clear that this time there would be no escape unless he complied. But he refused. Despite the agony and fear, Mr. Smith held out. His resilience likely saved his life because, unknown to the gang, their crimes were about to come to a violent end. On December 2, 2023, police received an anonymous tip-off about suspicious activity at the property. Armed officers stormed the location and uncovered a harrowing scene. Mr. Smith was found tied up, barely conscious, and severely injured. His body bore the marks of brutal torture, burns, cuts, and bruises covering nearly every inch. He had been locked in a cupboard, bound with electrical cables, left disoriented and broken. When officers approached, he looked up at them, desperation in his eyes, and pleaded, "Can you take me with you?" His first thought wasn't for himself, but for his family. He begged the police to be careful, fearing the gang would retaliate against them. The gang's reign of terror had finally come to an end, but the scars they left behind would never fully heal. Mr. Smith had survived the worst ordeal of his life, and now justice was on its way. The police investigation. The police investigation into this case was extensive and meticulous. Detectives in Salford quickly launched a full-scale inquiry, beginning with forensic analysis of the crime scene at Egret Drive. Officers recovered a cache of weapons, including a viable firearm, a magazine with live rounds, an imitation pistol, machetes, knives, a baseball bat, and cable ties used to restrain Mr. Smith. The discovery painted a grim picture of the gang's methods, showing their willingness to use extreme violence to achieve their aims. One of the most significant breakthroughs in the investigation came from forensic evidence. Detectives found cigarette butts scattered around the property, and DNA analysis linked them directly to multiple suspects, including Carl Johnson and Luke Johnson. In addition, police recovered documents belonging to Carl Johnson, further placing him at the crime scene. Cell site analysis of mobile phones also placed key gang members at Egret Drive on the days of the kidnappings, proving their direct involvement in the crime. As the investigation progressed, digital forensic specialists began analyzing the gang's communications. Encrypted messaging apps were used to coordinate attacks, ensuring minimal digital footprints. However, investigators were able to trace patterns in their conversations, identifying key moments where the gang plotted their next moves. Further analysis of the seized firearm and ammunition provided an irrefutable DNA match to Jonathan Nunes, linking him directly to the illegal possession of weapons. Another major breakthrough came from blockchain forensics. Police worked with cryptocurrency experts to track the stolen funds through various digital wallets, mixers, and decentralized exchanges. These laundering methods were designed to obscure the origin of the funds, but police collaborated with major crypto exchanges to freeze suspicious accounts, preventing further transactions. This was a rare instance where law enforcement successfully intervened in the movement of stolen cryptocurrency. Despite the gang's efforts to cover their tracks, their reliance on physical violence and repeated targeting of the same victim ultimately led to their downfall. With overwhelming evidence against them, police moved in for arrests. On January 30th, 2025, all 7 gang members faced justice at Manchester Crown Court, bringing an end to one of the UK's most harrowing crypto-related crime sprees. The courtroom was filled with a tense atmosphere as the judge outlined the severity of their actions. Each defendant had played a crucial role in the prolonged terror campaign against Mr. Smith, and the sentencing reflected the gravity of their offences. Jonathan Nunes, aged 24, was found guilty of attempted robbery, false imprisonment, kidnap, and possession of a prohibited firearm. His role as one of the key perpetrators in the violence earned him a sentence of 20 years in prison. David Povey, 38, was convicted of robbery, kidnap, and false imprisonment, also receiving 20 years behind bars. Luke Johnson, 25, faced charges of attempted robbery, false imprisonment, and kidnap, resulting in a 13-year and 6-month sentence. Gary Edwards, aged 47, pleaded guilty to attempted robbery and was sentenced to 10 years and 2 months. Kane Godiff, 33, also pleaded guilty to attempted robbery and was handed a sentence of 7 years and 5 months. Carl Johnson, aged 35, admitted to encouraging or assisting an offence of robbery, receiving a 3-year sentence. Lastly, Scott Armstrong, 39, was convicted of transferring criminal property and sentenced to 2 years and 4 months. In total, the gang received a combined 76 years in prison. The judge did not mince words, condemning their actions as deliberate, sustained, and sadistic. He emphasized that the use of extreme violence, manipulation, and repeated targeting of a vulnerable victim made this one of the most disturbing cases of crypto-related crime seen in the UK. As the sentences were read out, some of the defendants remained expressionless, while others showed visible frustration. But there was no escape. Justice had been served, and their reign of terror was finally over. This case serves as a stark warning about the dangers of cryptocurrency wealth. While digital assets offer financial freedom, they also attract criminals who see investors as easy targets. Unlike traditional bank fraud, crypto transactions are irreversible, making victims exceptionally vulnerable. Detective Sergeant Stephanie Bowling, who led the investigation, highlighted the growing dangers of crypto crime, urging investors to take extreme security precautions. The case of Mr. Smith is one of the most shocking examples in the UK, highlighting how violent gangs now see cryptocurrency investors as prime targets. Between January and November 2023, a ruthless gang systematically terrorized their victim, using threats, weapons, and physical violence to extract large sums of digital assets. After their initial success, they became bolder, returning to their victim multiple times, culminating in a horrifying final kidnapping, where they held him hostage and tortured him for days. What makes this case even more alarming is the methodical nature of the attacks. The gang used encrypted messaging apps to coordinate, ensuring minimal digital traces. They followed Mr. Smith's daily routine for weeks, striking when he was most vulnerable. DNA evidence and mobile phone data would later prove their presence at multiple crime scenes, but by then, the victim had endured nearly a year of torment. Despite the gang's efforts to cover their tracks, their reliance on physical violence and repeated visits to the same target ultimately led to their downfall. As cryptocurrency crime continues to evolve, so do the methods criminals use to exploit investors. While blockchain technology offers financial freedom, it also exposes individuals to extreme risk. The case of Mr. Smith is a wake-up call for the cryptocurrency world. Security is no longer just about passwords and encryption. For some, it can mean the difference between life and death.